You probably think you understand how a dry cleaner makes money. Someone drops off a wrinkled suit, a machine does something vaguely mysterious to it, a person presses it, and you pay a few dollars more than a regular wash would cost, because dry cleaning sounds specialized. Multiply that markup by a loyal base of office workers who need clean shirts every week, and it looks like one of the more boring, dependable small businesses you could buy. Steady cash flow, low tech, minimal disruption risk. That's the story sold in franchise brochures and small business forums. It's also almost entirely wrong, and the way it's wrong tells you something bigger about what this industry actually is. Start with the shop itself. Walk into a dry cleaner on a random street corner, and there's a good chance nothing in that building actually cleans your clothes. No machine, no solvent, no boiler. What you've walked into is called a drop store, a counter, a rack, a point of sale system, and a relationship with a separate facility a few miles away that does the real work. Your shirt gets bagged, tagged, and driven off-site, cleaned at what the industry calls a plant, then driven back for you to pick up. The plant might be doing the same job for 4, 5, sometimes a dozen storefronts under different names, none of which the customer ever sees. Industry listings for these businesses make the split explicit. You'll find plant and drop store packages sold as 2 separate assets, sometimes in 2 separate towns, with the plant quietly billing the drop store wholesale for every garment. That single fact reorganizes the whole picture. The business you can see, the friendly counter, the loyal customers, the full rack of clothes, is often the thinnest slice of the value chain. It carries relatively low startup costs, sometimes as little as $50,000 to $100,000, because it doesn't need industrial equipment. But it also surrenders a chunk of every dollar to the plant that actually does the cleaning. The plant, meanwhile, is expensive to build, expensive to run, and largely invisible to the public, which is exactly the kind of asymmetry that tends to produce winners and losers nobody expected. So what makes the plant so expensive? This is where the story stops looking like retail and starts looking like light industrial chemistry, because that's what it is. For most of the last 60 years, the default dry cleaning solvent has been perchloroethylene, PERC for short. It isn't a specialty soap. It's a chlorinated solvent, and depending on how you read the label, it's also classified by the EPA as a hazardous waste and treated by regulators as a probable human carcinogen. When your suit comes back from the cleaner smelling faintly chemical, that's PERC off-gassing. Roughly tens of thousands of dry cleaners across the country have used it. Figures cited by industry and regulatory sources put the number in the range of 25,000 to 30,000 facilities. And for decades, it was simply the cost of doing business, the way a nail salon uses acetone or a garage uses solvent-based degreaser. What makes dry cleaning unusual is scale and geography. These machines have historically sat inside strip malls, ground floors of apartment buildings, and busy commercial corridors, not out on an industrial park, but wedged between a nail salon and a pizza place, often sharing plumbing and occasionally sharing soil with the building next door. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because it's the root of the single biggest financial risk in this entire industry. And it's a risk almost nobody weighing whether to buy a dry cleaner actually prices in correctly. PERC leaks. Not dramatically usually, a worn gasket, a small spill during transfer, a slow drip from an aging machine over years. The kind of thing that looks like nothing at the time. But PERC is dense. It doesn't evaporate cleanly from soil the way gasoline does, and it moves downward into groundwater instead of spreading out and breaking down. Environmental consultants who specialize in this exact problem have found that a striking share of both currently operating and long-closed dry cleaning sites test positive for contamination. Some assessments put it as high as 3 out of 4. And once it's found, it doesn't stay a hypothetical. A basic environmental screening, called a Phase 1 assessment, runs a couple $1,000s just to check. If that check turns something up, a more invasive Phase 2 assessment, actual soil borings, actual lab work, runs $15,000 to $20,000 just to find out how bad it is. And how bad is where the real number lives. Consultants who work exclusively on this kind of cleanup have compared it directly to the most famous small site contamination problem in America, the old abandoned gas station. A typical gas station cleanup runs somewhere around $350,000. A typical dry cleaner site, contaminated with PERC, runs somewhere in the range of $600,000 to over $1 million. PERC is simply harder and more expensive to remove from soil and groundwater than petroleum is. So the business you thought you were buying, a counter, a rack, some steady weekly customers, can be sitting unknowingly on top of a liability worth several times the purchase price of the business itself. This isn't a theoretical scenario dreamed up to make a video sound dramatic. It happened in exactly this shape to a real dry cleaner owner in Orange, California. And his story is worth walking through slowly because it shows the whole mechanism at once. Thomas DePippo owned a shop called Julie's Cleaners. He ran it the way most owners in this industry do. Steady, unremarkable, a small piece of the neighborhood. Then, a routine soil test underneath the property came back showing a chemical the state considered potentially carcinogenic had seeped into the ground. That single test triggered a cleanup that ultimately cost him $200,000. In his own words, reported at the time, it cost him his entire life savings and his marriage. Not because he was reckless, because the ground under a building he'd operated for years had been quietly absorbing small amounts of solvent for longer than anyone had been checking. After the cleanup, he switched his operation to wet cleaning, a water-based alternative that doesn't use perc at all, becoming one of many owners who learned this lesson the expensive way rather than the cheap way. DePippo's story landed at almost the exact moment the entire industry's rules were about to change, and understanding the timing explains why so many owners were forced into the same choice he made, whether they'd had a contamination scare or not. California became the first state in the country to ban perc from dry cleaning altogether. The phase-out didn't happen overnight. It was staged over roughly 15 years. No new perc machines could be purchased starting in 2008. Machines older than 15 years had to be pulled from service by 2010. Machines operating in buildings that shared walls with homes or apartments had to switch even earlier. And by January 1st, 2023, every last perc machine in the state had to be gone, full stop. The federal EPA later approved California's rule as more stringent than the national standard, effectively making it the model other regulators would watch. And more recently, the EPA has moved towards a national phase-out of perc as well, giving owners of older machines a much shorter runway, a few years, while owners of newer, better-contained systems get up to a decade to transition. Here's why that regulatory timeline turns into a business problem instead of just a compliance headnote. A replacement machine using an alternative solvent isn't a cheap swap. Depending on capacity, a new alternative solvent machine can run anywhere from $60,000 to well over $100,000, and that's before accounting for the building modifications that sometimes come with it: wider doorways, upgraded electrical service, new ventilation. Wet cleaning systems, which use water and specialized detergents instead of any solvent at all, are meaningfully cheaper, sometimes $40,000 to $80,000 less than the alternative solvent option. But they require retraining staff and reworking how delicate garments are handled, since it's a genuinely different process, not just a different chemical in the same machine. For a large operator running several plants, that's a manageable capital expense spread across a bigger revenue base. For a single owner running one plant and maybe one drop store, it can be close to the entire value of the business, arriving all at once on a government deadline they don't control. And that's precisely the mechanism behind a trend you can already see if you look at who's buying and selling dry cleaners today. Standalone plants shutting down, and the hub and spoke structure, one well-capitalized plant supplying multiple branded drop stores, becoming the industry's dominant survival shape, rather than just one option among many. So regulation was squeezing supply. At almost exactly the same time, something else was squeezing demand. And this part had been building quietly for 20 years before anyone noticed it as a crisis. Dry cleaning revenue in the United States had already been drifting downward well before the pandemic, losing a small percentage of its value most years through the 2010s. The reason wasn't mysterious. Fewer people were wearing clothes that needed professional cleaning. Business casual crept into offices that used to require suits. Fabrics changed, more performance blends, more machine-washable synthetics, fewer garments with a dry clean only tag in the first place. Trade groups like the National Cleaners Association had been describing this shift for years as a structural, not seasonal problem. Then remote work didn't just continue the trend, it detonated it. Before the pandemic, the industry was estimated at roughly $9 billion in annual revenue across more than 30,000 businesses. Within about a year and a half, industry researchers estimated it had lost over $1 billion in revenue and nearly 1,000 businesses outright. Individual owners described losses that sound less like a bad quarter and more like a business being switched off. A Miami operator running 3 stores and a plant said his volume dropped 90% at the worst point, recovering only partway to a 50 or 60% decline. Trade groups estimated that at the industry's low point, national revenue was running at roughly half of what it had been before the pandemic, with the majority of owners going without a paycheck themselves just to keep the doors open. Now, put both pressures next to each other, because this is the actual chain reaction that defines the modern economics of this business. Tightening environmental regulation forces expensive machine replacements, right as demand for the core service, cleaning business clothes, is structurally shrinking. Owners who can least afford a $100,000 equipment upgrade are the same owners whose weekly suit and shirt volume has been quietly evaporating for a decade. That combination is what pushes standalone shops to sell, consolidate into wholesale arrangements, or simply close, while better capitalized operators absorb their customers through hub-and-spoke networks and delivery apps. Here's the part that reverses almost everyone's intuition about which dry cleaner is actually doing well. A shop with a packed rack of clothes and a line at the counter looks from the sidewalk like the healthiest business on the block. But if that shop is a drop store paying wholesale rates to an outside plant, a meaningful slice of every dollar walking in the door walks right back out to someone else. Meanwhile, the plant a few miles away, quiet, unglamorous, no walk-in customers, sometimes not even visible from the street, might be the actual profit engine, billing 5 different storefronts and a hospital contract, running at high utilization with none of the retail overhead. The visible business and the valuable business are frequently not the same building. Foot traffic tells you about the storefront. It tells you almost nothing about who's making money. The owners who've survived the last decade generally didn't survive by cleaning more suits. They survived by changing what they clean and how customers reach them. Household textiles, comforters, drapes, area rugs don't depend on anyone's office dress code and became a deliberate pivot for shops trying to replace lost shirt volume. Wash and fold laundry service, alterations, and same-day turnaround became bigger shares of revenue than they used to be. Institutional and wholesale contracts, hotels, hospitals, uniformed staff offered steadier volume than walk-in retail. And a wave of pickup and delivery apps, along with smart lockers in apartment buildings and office lobbies, tried to solve the industry's other structural problem, that even people who still need dry cleaning increasingly don't want to make a special trip to get it done. What's notable is what didn't happen. In most declining, capital-intensive industries, you'd expect a handful of large chains to buy up the wreckage and consolidate the market, the way it played out in gas stations, in pharmacies, in a dozen other categories under similar pressure. Dry cleaning never fully did that. Trade research has repeatedly found that no single company controls more than about 5% of the U.S. market. It remains one of the most fragmented family-run categories in American retail, even after 2 decades of decline and a pandemic that should have accelerated consolidation. Part of the reason is the very liability we started with. Buying an existing dry cleaner means potentially buying whatever's sitting in the soil underneath it, and that risk has made larger, risk-averse buyers cautious about scaling up through acquisition in a way it hasn't in almost any comparable industry. So, where does that leave someone actually considering this as an investment today? The optimistic case is real, and it's not fantasy. A well-run plant with wholesale contracts, a diversified revenue mix beyond suits, a location without legacy contamination, and a founder who bought in early on wet cleaning or another non-perk process can be a genuinely stable, cash-generating small business, particularly if it owns rather than leases its real estate. The realistic survivable case looks more like what most existing owners are living through right now. Thinner margins than a decade ago, revenue held up by wash and fold and household textiles rather than suits, and a constant awareness that the next environmental deadline or the next round of remote work adoption could force another round of investment or another round of losses. The realistic failure case is the one nobody budgets for until it happens. A soil test comes back positive, a 6-figure cleanup consumes years of profit in a single event, and an owner who thought they were running a service business discovers they were actually holding an environmental liability with a storefront attached. Which brings us back to the assumption we started with. A dry cleaner looks like a simple, low-tech neighborhood service business built on a modest markup for pressing shirts. It isn't. Underneath that storefront sits a chemically intensive, capital-heavy operation tied to a shrinking discretionary category of spending that depends on people wearing clothes they mostly don't wear anymore, wrapped around a liability that can sit invisible in the ground for years before it surfaces all at once. The shirt was never really the product. The product was always who agreed to absorb the risk buried in the soil, the risk of an aging machine, the risk of a regulation with a deadline attached, and the risk that fewer people every year still have a reason to wear something that needs it.